Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom Podcast, episode number 78, and we're calling this one the Esoteric Simulation. As you can see, I've got a collection of Blade Runner, Philip K. Dick related books. I've been making my way through Future Noir and recently re-picked up the Rutger Hauer All These Moments with Patrick Quinlan, making a Blade Runner, Paul M. Salmon. I've had this one. I think I've owned both of these books twice. We've got the Exegesis of Philip K. Dick on the table here, edited Pamela Jackson and Jonathan Levin, and K.W. Jetter's Replicant Night and Blade Runner 2. I think one of our first podcasts, we started out talking about the Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. Maybe in those first podcasts, like the first 5 podcasts, I was talking about H.P. Lovecraft and Philip K. Dick. And I think I've done a podcast on K.W. Jeter, who was a friend of Philip K. Dick's, and he wrote some Blade Runner and kind of Dr. Sleep style. He tried to do some work with these sequels that blend the film Blade Runner with the novel of Do Androids Dream of the Electric Sheep. I mean, it's also divergent to the Blade Runner 2049 kind of versions of sequels. So we'll kind of get into all of this sort of stuff. So yeah, we're calling the podcast Esoteric Simulation, Reincarnating Blade Runner, the Recursive Rhizomes, and the Transmigrations of Philip K. Dick and K.W. Jeter. So I kind of think I would start off in the beginning, just kind of maybe talking about simulation in general. So, Philip K. Dick was a big fan of the simulation theory. His idea that we were living in a simulation. One interview that's classic. You can go search Philip K. Dick simulation out on YouTube. You'll get the video for that. But I guess the idea, the central theme today is the esoteric nature of simulation. The idea of recursion, the concept of copies. And you quickly get into that esoteric space because isn't it kind of like a reincarnation every time we reboot a franchise? Or isn't it kind of like a transmigration when you take a novel, you take Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and you turn it into a film, you've transmigrated, or I guess it's transubstantiated. I don't know. Transmigration is transmigration of souls, right? But you're kind of like, I guess I'm talking about transubstantiation. So we're getting into all of those other topics. Exegesis of Philip K. Dick is another place to start. It's a super. For those of you who don't know, Dick had many of these ideas of simulation throughout his life, and he had some of these Gnostic. He had this Gnostic experience where he got this flash of light while after a root canal. He was on painkillers, and he sort of saw, it's almost like he had some kind of breakdown or something like that, but he sort of saw reality as stacked and simulated, and also some features of where time was not quite right. And I think a lot of these themes come out in his books. In Ubik, there's some great scenes where there's retrocausality and things like this. I think maybe we can open with a quote about this right in the beginning here. Dick says, in terms of Ubik, not the novel, but the force described in my novel, I was already becoming aware of the total coherence where the universe is moving toward, and which bombards us backwards, so to speak, with information about itself, thus giving us a certain awareness of itself. I would think that for purely fictional purposes, the description given and the name given in the novel would be more rather than less accurate vis-a-vis a tachyon theory, which is now connected with the theory that the universe is moving from chaos to form. Ubik talks to us from the future, from the end state to which everything is moving. Thus, Ubik is not here, which is to say now, but will be. And when we get its information about and from Ubik, as we receive TV or radio signals from transmitters located in other spaces in the time continuum. I see no objection to interpreting the meaning of the force Ubik this way, nor in interpreting the purpose of the novel Ubik by saying that in it I was trying in a dim and unconscious way to express a series of experiences I had most of my life of a directing, shaping, and assisting, and informing force much wiser than us, which we in no way could perceive directly. Where it was or what it could be, I do not know. I knew it by its effect. In Kant's terms, it is, or as I understand now will be, a thing in itself. And thus I would express the purpose of the novel, my purpose anyhow, to be a fictional statement containing the presentation of this direct presence, which I arbitrarily chose the name Ubik for. That Ubik, or more accurately, the future total gestalt of purpose and meaning, may well have written the book through me, is possible, but only in the sense that all creatures from grasshoppers on up, in particularly small creatures such as grasshoppers, are written through by what we call instinct, rather than writing their lives. However, I do not think one could say this. Rather, I have read Ubik by Philip K. Dick. One could put it this way: Philip K. Dick by Ubik. Okay, so you get this kind of idea. He's coming down a bit. He's talking about transmissions, Holy Spirit, glossolalia. But I think from a simulation point of view, even the origin of Blade Runner, as you guys know, Blade Runner, the movie, came out of the idea of do androids dream of electric sheep? Now, already in the title of it, it says so much about simulation, right? We have in the simulation here this concept of the copy, right? The android is already a copy. And now electric sheep, it's fake dreams, right? So there's already this kind of a novel that's already kind of going to be leading us into things about copies, clones. So when we get to the idea of simulation, the first kind of level of that is just copying each other. You make a clone of something, right? You copy and paste, you clone it. That's inside of the simulation, right? That's just it's like an Agent Smith in the Matrix. So there's many versions of them and they can just spawn. But the idea of a whole simulation as being clonable, like, a whole containerization. And what's interesting is, when you start to go through the passage of time, right? We start looking at things like Dick writes, let's frame it this way. Dick writes, do androids dream of electric sheep, to talk about simulation. His work is translated into Blade Runner. And there's a fascinating story of how difficult it was to translate the copy in the copy, right? But then we get Blade Runner, and with actors from Blade Runner. And now we have diverging timelines. And there's two, because look, there's a KW Jeter tries to rewrite it. Then there's Blade Runner 2049 that rewrites it. So now you start to see that there's this reincarnation, there's this repetition, there's a dying and re-rising. This transmigration concept, right, is in there as well. So you see in Do Androids Dream Electric Sheep, talk about Dave Holden, right? He goes, maybe I'm worried, Rick Deckard conjectured. And what happened to Dave will happen to me. And Andy smart enough to laser him could probably take me too. But that didn't seem to be it. I see you through the poop sheet on that new brain unit, Inspector Bryant said, hanging up the vid phone. Rick said, yeah, I heard about it on the grapevine. How many Andys are involved and how did they get Dave? 8 to start with, Bryant said, consulting his clipboard. Dave got the first 2. And the remaining 6 are here in Northern California? As far as we know. Dave thinks so. That was him I was talking to. I have his notes that were at my desk. He says all he knows is here. Bryant tapped the bundle of notepaper. So far he didn't seem to incline to pass notes to Rick. For some reason he continued to leaf through them, frowning. I have nothing on my agenda, Rick offered. I'm ready to take over Dave's place. Bryant said thoughtfully, Dave used the Voight-Kampff altered scale to test out the individuals he suspected. You realize, you ought to anywhere, that this test isn't specific for the new brain units. No test is. The Voight scale, altered 3 years ago by Kampff, as we all have, is all we have. Dave considered it accurate. Maybe it is. But I would suggest this. Before you take it out after these 6, fly to Seattle, Talk to the Rosen people. Have them supply you with representative sampling of types employing the new Nexus 6 unit. And then put them through the void comp, Rick said. Sounds so easy. Pardon? I think I'll take you talk to Rosen while you're on your way out. I'm going to discuss with them possibilities of including several humans, as well as their new androids. But you won't know. It'll be my decision, in conjunction with the manufacturers. It's the first time you'll be acting as a senior bounty hunter. Dave knows a lot. He's got a lot of experience behind him. So have I, Rick said. You've handled assignments devolving you from Dave's schedule. Everything's based on the assumption, and that's the entire list. And yet the Voight-Kampf altered scale has only been administered to the first three. The two Dave retired, and then Polakov. It was while Dave was administering the test that Polakov lasered him. So you can kind of see, why do I give you a little flavor of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Because you get the vibe already of Blade Runner, different dialogue, different kind of concepts going on there. But I think how this gets copied, right? The idea of cloning and copies and using the Voight-Kampf test to suss them out. You go into this Baudrillard simulacra and simulation, and there's a section here on cloning. It says, if all the prostheses that mark the history of the body, the double is doubtless the oldest. But the double is precisely not a prosthesis. It is an imaginary figure, which, just like the soul, the shadow, the mirror image, haunts the subject like his other, which makes it so that the subject is simultaneously itself and never resembles itself again, which haunts the subject like a subtle and always averted death. This not always is the case. In other words, the imaginary power and wealth of the double, the one in which strangeness and at the same time the intimacy of the subject to itself are played out, Heimlich and Unheimlich, rests on the immateriality, on the fact that it is and remains a phantasm. Everyone can dream and must have dreamed his whole life of a perfect duplication or multiplication of his being. But such copies only have the power of dreams and are destroyed when one attempts to force the dream into the real. Cloning, human cuttings ad infinitum. Each individual cell of an organism capable of again becoming the matrix of an identical individual. In the United States, a child is born a few months ago like a geranium from cuttings. The first clone child, the firstborn from a single cell, his father the sole progenitor, of which he would be the exact replica, the perfect twin, the double. Dream of an eternal twisting substitution for procreation that is linked to death. Cellular dream of scissiparity, the purest form of parentage, because it finally allows one to do without the other, to go from the same to the same. Monocellular utopia, which, by way of genetics, allows complex beings to achieve their destiny of protozoas. So, sort of have, Baudrillard kind of talking to us about the cloning, and in a way, like the simulation is about a cloning. And what's interesting is there is always this idea of copying to a new medium, right? So the idea is a clone is the exact copy. Think of that in terms of mass reproduction, right? Like, if you think of the, I think they talk about Roy Batty in here, that there's many copies of Roy Batty, for example. It says, Harry Bryant said, Rick Deckard hung up. Androids are stupid, he said. Roy Batty couldn't tell me from you. It thought you were at the door. The police will clean up here. Why don't you go stay in the apartment building? They'll be fine. I'm leaving the building, Isidore said. I'm going to live deeper in town. I think there's a vacant apartment in my building, Rick said. I don't want to live near you. Go outside or upstairs. Don't stay in here. The special floundered, not knowing what to do. What a job to have, Rick thought. I'm a scourge. I'm like a famine or a plague. Where I go, the ancient curse follows. As Mercer said, I'm required to do wrong. Everything I've done has been wrong from the start. Anyhow, it's time to forget it. Maybe I'll be home after a while. So, Rick reflecting on retiring a copy, a clone, and also kind of feeling how he is part of some dread or cosmic plague or curse. I think it's kind of interesting, right? So some of this gets translated into the mood and the vibe of the Blade Runner movie. And as you know, this movie was pretty tumultuous to make. And I think that the idea of, you think about a writer sits down to write, and then as we transmigrate to the film, there's a whole crew of new writers that are trying to adapt it to screen, coming up with ways like, how do we present that in a way? How do we replicate it? And I think what's interesting is we'll get quickly to this nature of the replica, because in K.W. Jeter's third Blade Runner, or second Blade Runner book, he wrote first Blade Runner 2, The Edge of Humor, which is a sequel of Blade Runner, and a sequel of Do Androids Dream Electric Sheep. But then his next follow-up book after Blade Runner 2, Replicant Night, it's actually quite bizarre because they are making a movie of Blade Runner in the Blade Runner universe about the life of Rick Deckard. So you can see that even Jeter is sort of using the tricks of recursion and simulation. And these are old tricks, right? I mean, if you think back to Shakespeare, Hamlet has the play within the play, right? And for those of you who aren't up on my references, it's like in Game of Thrones, maybe you remember how there was the play of Joffrey, Arya first learns of Ned Stark's death by seeing the play where Joffrey has Ned Stark beheaded. And then there's I think they even do it in House of Dragon, where they're talking about Rhaenyra. There's a play about Rhaenyra, the Mummer's Farce, as they'll call it. But this idea of the play within the play is throughout everything. And I think it's also anywhere where there's a sequel or a copy, right? So sequels and copies have a kind of a certain tension. And there's simple copies, right? We have the replicant, which is just a copy or a clone. But then, for example, you'll have this idea of maybe, I don't know, like Star Wars and then Star Wars The Force Awakens, right? They're not quite clones, right? Where you start to reboot something. And this sort of starts to see, this is the simulation. I think it's a Lacanian drifting subject, because each iteration brings in new material, and then it slowly has it. There's also some kind of copy degradation that goes on. So you've got to think about these. These are bigger terms, right, to kind of play with. But if we go into the making of Blade Runner, I think there's some interesting things. Starting out, the script wars. There was lots of script battles and script changes. I think about the Alien franchise. I always liked the Alien 3, but then I had found out that William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer, had written his own Alien 3 script. I believe I'm right. William Gibson's Alien 3. So then you start to have this idea of the rhizome, this rhizomic feature where, there's a branching happening. There's the Alien 3 gets made, and then Alien 3 script does not get made. You've got these other proto-scripts that come in with Hampton Fancher. Obviously, Ridley Scott had a hand in some of the shaping of it. I think Philip K. Dick had some hand in it. Fancher and Scott began collaborating on the Dangerous Days rewrite in April 1980. Dangerous Days being the initial screenplay. And what's interesting, too, about even the initial screenplay, I think in the original Dangerous Days screenplay, Hampton Fancher tells a story of how there's a boiling pot on the stove when Deckard comes in to retire his first replicant. Something that they actually lift, and they use it as a nod, because Ryan Gosling goes in, and the character played by Dave Bautista, he has a pot boiling. So you're kind of like using these film noir techniques. Even from our little reading of this, you got a film noir idea. But the idea that it's recursion and the idea of revising the script as we try to translate it, there's a lot of script problems from this. For example, in many ways, the revision was remarkably similar to the final film. In July 24, script opens with Leon's Voight-Kampff test, for example, and much of the dialogue between Leon and Holden is exactly the same as that heard in the motion picture. Also similar, if not exactly alike, were scenes involving Captain Bryant debriefing Deckard on escaped androids, Deckard searching Leon's hotel room, entering the Nexus 6 snapshots, Deckard running a Voight-Kampff on Rachel. Certain sequences in the July 24th script also duplicate passages found in Dick's original novel. Deckard first meets Rachel at the Tyrell Corporation in an elevator before walking past her with a menagerie of real animals. Right, so you start seeing some of this, and there actually is a reference here. The missing sixth replicant later became the cause of much confusion and speculation. In fact, K.W. Jetter's authorized 1995 novelized sequel to the film, Blade Runner 2, The Edge of Human, includes one main character who's convinced that Deckard is the sixth replicant, but the truth of the matter is much more mundane. Again, another thing that they pulled into reality in the sequel. So they kind of ran with a lot of these things. They didn't run with Jeter's rewrite, though. They went a different way, and I think that's kind of was a mistake a bit. But we'll see. I think maybe it just gets it to live in a special spoiler, in a special, what do you want to call it, Easter egg of its own, right? It gets to have its own universe. Now the Jeter Blade Runner universe is born. Another thing about making the film, obviously, is Ridley Scott's storyboards highlighted here. We also know that there were production problems throughout making this. They went over budget. A lot of the scenes were, I want to say, they were made in the edit. A lot of it was made in the edit. And classic designs in the movie, like of this section here, they're talking about the mother blimp and the noodle bar. We're replicating a 2019 version of Los Angeles from 1981, right? So you got the noodle bar, scenes at the, typical Southeast Asian kind of looking place. And you've got the blimp overhead and the audio that says, off-world. The newspaper that Harrison Ford is seen in the film reading, its headline is Farming the Oceans, the Moon, and Antarctica. This same paper will appear 2 more times in Blade Runner as the lining of a drawer in Leon's hotel and as Deckard's reading material while he waits for Zora outside her dressing room. So they've made the actual newspaper. Do we have a shot of it here? No, it's just that shot. So the film gets made. And with a number of production problems. And I feel like these production problems are kind of like going back to this idea of, there's a quote I always liked in Zizek, this Parallax View, where he's talking about the Matrix films. And I actually wanted to do a podcast about this at one point, but I sort of never got around to it. But the idea here is, talk about the Matrix films. The idea of how the first Matrix movie sort of hit a nerve. The similarity with the Matrix is unmistakable. The truth of both films is today's predominance of the politics of jouissance. So Matrix, when it first happened, when Matrix first came out, it was kind of one of these forces that happened. And everybody had a kind of Matrix moment in those films, to the point where they're all memes today, and it's so cliche, red pill, blue pill, black pill, everything's pilled now, right? The problem didn't continue with the remakes, with the sequels, though. So as they made the sequels, they were, as Zizek says, The Matrix Reloaded plays with a series of ways to overcome the inconsistencies of the prequel. But in doing so, it gets entangled in new inconsistencies of its own. I kind of remember leaving The Matrix and having this kind of Gnostic, Sufi kind of like moment of thinking like, oh, what would be great if they made a sequel that was about how even Zion was fake, right? It like the single layer of it made it seem boring, right? So what happens is, so my idea was they would realize kind of like, oh, not only is the Matrix a construct, but actually Zion is a construct, and they have to go deeper through to find what's the true nature of things, right? I thought that would be a much more epic idea of dethroning Neo as the one. He's just one able to break through, and then he realizes he has to break through the next one, and it's sort of like the alien acid blood, right? The one drop goes through each level, and as you look down, you can see it. And this is a lot what Philip K. Dick was sort of, I guess his Valis experience was a lot like this, where he started seeing the world was, like he would use a metaphor of the black iron prison, and he would talk about the Roman Empire never ended, saying how it's sort of like it's still in another layer, like hyper superimposed, let's say. So Zizek goes on and talks about the basic tone is of an additional complications and suspicions which belie the simple and clear ideology of liberation from the Matrix. So it starts to have like the idea of the underground city of Zion kind of doesn't really work. That whole thing doesn't really work. It's like the extra of the Matrix. So what is Neo's rebellion really? It's like, it doesn't really make sense, right? Just kind of, and then I think Matrix Revolution just becomes the Matrix Reloaded. The Wachowski brothers thus consistently raise the stakes, confronting us with all the complications and confusions of the process of liberation. And if the Matrix Revolutions were to succeed, it would have to produce nothing less than the appropriate answer to the dilemmas of the revolutionary politics of today. The first sign of the failure of the broken contract with us, the spectators, the ontological premise of The Matrix Part 1 is straightforward and realistic. There is a real reality and a virtual universe of The Matrix which can be explained entirely in terms of what went on in reality. The Matrix Revolutions breaks these rules. The magic powers of Neo and Smith extend into the real reality. So now Neo can stop bullets in the real world, and Agent Smith possesses the guy, right? So this is not like a detective novel in which, after a series of complex clues, the proposed solution would be the murderer has magic powers and we're able to commit his crime by violating the laws of our reality. The reader would feel cheated, as in the Matrix Revolutions, where the predominant tone is one of faith. The second failure is a more narrative one, the simplicity of the proposed solution. Things are not really explained, so that the final solution is more like the proverbial cutting of the Gordian knot. This is especially deplorable when we consider the many interesting dark hints in Matrix Reloaded. Morpheus as dangerous paranoiac, the corruption of the ruling elite of Zion City, which are left unexplored in Revolutions. The only interesting new aspect of Revolutions, the focus on the inner world, neither Matrix nor reality, is also underdeveloped. So this is kind of like that inner world, but I guess there's a kind of like, the paradox of the architect and the oracle. So basically, he kind of states in this a bit about the work can't be resolved because of the nature of reality. Like, there's limits to how much we can fold things together and still retain their recursive value. And so I think when we look back to the transformation of Philip K. Dick's world into Blade Runner, we get to the point where you've got a film with lots of strange goings-on. You've got a difficulty to make the film, but then finally a cult classic. It wasn't even a financial success at first. It was a cult classic. So we get the film Blade Runner, and then we break into the sort of idea of, again, branching out one more time. We've got K.W. Jetter's Blade Runner 2, The Edge of Human. One thing that's great about this in the sense of simulation is Jeter brings up this kind of recursion. Maybe it's fan fiction-y. I don't know what you guys think. Have you guys read it? You can leave a comment below if you read it. I think they're great books. I think they're really great because of what I think is, as a friend of Philip K. Dick, I think you can see a picture of them in the back here, KW and PK. So, first of all, you get this throwback in the beginning of Blade Runner 2 where, at the end of Blade Runner, the film, Rick Deckard and Rachel, they drive off. And But because we know that replicants, from the lore of the movie, from the mechanics of the film, we know that when replicants die off, they have an expiration date, right? So they're not going to live a full life. So to get ahead of this, in Blade Runner 2, K.W. Jeter sets out this concept where Deckard is keeping Rachel in cold pack, which is kind of like like a sleep chamber, sort of like in the Alien films, right? Those sleep pods. And by letting her be cryogenically frozen for periods of time, he could extend how long she lives. She just will have fewer days. So at first he would wake her up like, she'd sleep for 3 weeks and be awake for a month, right? And then it would be more like he would do it a week every other month. And then it would be like 3 days every month, right? And then it would be, a day every other month. And then, something like this. So it's waking her up fewer and fewer times. On the wall of the coffin, he'd hung a calendar that had been left behind the cabin's previous occupants, whoever had been there. When he and Rachel had come to this place, they hadn't even been spiders in the ancient webs along the ceiling. The calendar was way out of date. 2 decades old, a faded hollow shot of a millennium celebratory riots in New York's Times Square. It didn't matter. All he used it for was to mark off the days, the interval that was still rational part of his head and ordained until the next time he'd wake her up. At first it had been every month, her long sleep broken for a full day, 24 hours of conscious life, time together, real time. Everything else was waiting for him, even more than her. At least she could sleep through her dying. He didn't even have the luxury. Now it was every 2 months for 12 hours. A decision they made together, the grim economy of her death. No, he thought, mine. He stood up. 2.5 weeks until the next time they could be together. Restless, he walked outside the cabin again. I know what's on your mind, a voice spoke from behind him. He felt another's hand touch his shoulder. He didn't dare look back because he knew the voice. I bet you do, replied Deckard. Her voice. Weariness swept over him. A last defeat. He hoped he'd been dead before he got to the point where he began to hallucinate. In the moon's shadow, the small creature scurried away through the dead leaves, as though in the holy dread. Since you're something inside my head anyway. Am I? She whispered, as he felt the hand brush against the side of his neck. How do you know? He sighed. It would be the absolute dead end of his luck, to wind up arguing logic with his own hallucinations. Because, he said, because you sound just like Rachel, and she's already lying in her coffin asleep as good as dead. Then look at me. You don't have to be afraid. The hand's touch dropped away from his neck. He turned slowly, first bringing the gaze around, to see her, to complete the hallucination. He saw Rachel standing there in front of him in the darkness, her skin paled beyond death by the moon's partial spectrum. Her dark hair was swept back, the precise arrangement he remembered from the first time he had ever seen her in another life, a world far away, different from this one. The way she had worn her hair then, walking across the deep shadowed spaces of the Tyrell corporations. What do you see? I see you, Rachel. That's how I know I've lost it. My mind. Grief and loneliness had won. He had walked through the left, opened a small door inside his head, the doors torn from their hinges, and so there was no division anymore between what he wished for and what he perceived. That's what's called being insane, he told the image as he saw her standing before him. I don't care, you win. A sad smile lifted the corner of the image's mouth, the image of the woman he loved. Is there no possibility? The image of Rachel touched his hand, fingertips cold against his skin, that I could be real? Oh, sure, the thought didn't cheer him. I could be screwing up some other way. His eyes and other senses lying to him. Traitor thoughts. Maybe you really are here. But where I lost it was back in the cabin when I was taking care of you. I thought I'd had the controls set for taking care of you to go on sleeping. That's maybe where I was hallucinating. Maybe you'd wake up again. He took her hand in his. But che glida mania. He used to pick that one by the ear on the piano in his flat back in L.A., everyone's first opera tune. Your little hand is frozen. Don't bother translating. I know the words. And I don't mind the cold. So here, this scene is also stolen kind of in a way in Blade Runner 2049 when Deckard sees the clone of Rachel. But in Jedder's book, it's not a clone of Rachel. It's the original niece of Tyrell named Sarah. So in this scene, it's like Deckard's thinking that he's gone mad, and where Rachel lays in cold pack, he's hearing her voice and hallucinating her, but then he slowly comes to realize that it's Sarah Tyrell, the niece of Tyrell that they reference in the film that Rachel was based on, the replicant Rachel is based on. Now, I thought this was interesting also in the sense of replicant and the film Transmigration, let's call it. So they didn't take Jeter's idea, which I think is way more interesting than having Jared Leto's scene where Rachel comes out and he says he got the eyes wrong or whatever he says, right? I mean, okay, it's kind of an interrogation scene, but this scene works so much better. I wonder why they didn't go this way. It's very film noir. It's very interesting. If we go back to Cold Pack, though, so he's got Rachel in the Cold Pack. Cold Pack comes right out of Ubik, which you talked about earlier, too. So Cold Pack, here we got Runciter is going to upright in her transparent casket, encased in the effulgent, icy mist. Ella Runciter lay with her eyes shut, her hands lifted permanently toward her impassive face. It had been 3 years since he had seen Ella, and of course she had not changed. She never would now, at least not in the outward physical way. With each resuscitation into the active half-life, into a return of cerebral activity, however short, Ella died somewhat, and the remaining time left to her pulse phased out and ebbed. Knowledge of this underwrote his failures to rev her up more often. He rationalized it this way. That it doomed her to that activated her consisted of a sin against her. As to her own stated wishes before her death and in early half-life encounters, this had been hardly nebulous in his mind. Anyway, he would know better, being 4 times as old as she was. What had she wished? To continue to function with him as co-owner of Runciter Associates? Something vague on that order? Well, they had granted that wish. Now, for example, and 6 or 7 times in the past, he did consult her at each crisis of the organization, and he did so at the moment. So here he is. Runciter has his wife, Ella. She is in Cold Pack, and he's visiting her only infrequently. This is out of Philip K. Dick's Ubik. Again, we were talking about Ubik at the beginning, just the idea of this copy backwards into the TV he mentions in the exegesis. So another thing that comes out of this, we have the Salander 3. Salander 3 had mired him in the screen after screen of access denied, authorized personnel lower. The Salander 3 was the ship that had occupied, since Salander 3, the last one before the UN clamped down on corporate interstellar travel. This is the ship that brings the replicants back. But it also is, the Salander 3 is also in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It said, the Buster Friendly Show broadcast all over Earth via satellite, had poured down the immigrants from the colony planets. Practice transmissions beamed to Proxima had been attempted, and in case human colonization extended that far, had the Salander 3 reached its destination, the travelers aboard would have found the Buster Friendly Show awaiting them. But the Salander 3 doesn't do that. It crashes back to Earth, and that's where the replicants are released. And we kind of get that in the movie, too. Like something with the Roy Batty and his team, I believe. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about the Salander 3 lore. But another part of the sequel I thought was interesting was he kept his eyes walking around these echoes inside a room, a little more poking around and bumped to a few scraps. A low-res news photo of the Salander 3 mission leaders, Anson Tyrell and his wife Ruth, setting out with big smiles for Proxima. And 6 years later, the day after the Salander 3 had come limping back to the docking terminal at San Pedro, the notice of the cremation services for them. You didn't need cop savvy to get suspicious about that. There wasn't a cover-up deep enough to keep corpses frozen between here and Prox for giving off decayed smell of murder. So you get here this kind of idea that the one detail to bring up is the kind of like the classic one would be Stephen King's The Shining and Kubrick's The Shining, very divergent, right? But I think with the making of Dr. Sleep, you get this idea of King also trying to take ownership of that gap. And I think here we get examples of how K.W. Jeter was trying to close the gap. You know, what Blade Runner morphs into, a very different thing from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. But you see he's crossing the lore and kind of weaving it back together. There's another interesting thing. I just saw this. Before that, while your uncle was still alive, he used you for, what's it called? The specific word was stuck back in his memory and it wouldn't come out. The templant. The term of art in the Tyrell Labs is templant, as in replicant. But you're right. That's what my uncle used me for. The source model for your Rachel. On her face, eyes narrowed. The partial smile was a knife wound, even thinner. And his. The source model for your Rachel and his. Oh, he had his own Rachel. And this is also interesting. So Sarah kind of dishes the dirt that part of the copying was that Tyrell had his own copy of Rachel. More spooky things. The creepy business of the dead. He could hear them in her voice. And just like in Ubik, it's quite creepy. There's the scene where in Ubik, while Ella is lying in cold pack, she's hallucinating with other proximately cold packed individuals. So the creepy business of the dead sort of sees that degradation of the simulation, right? Just like we see in the Matrix, all those pods, right? The pods are actually where the interface is, right? The liminal space. More spooky things, the creepy business of the dead. He could hear them in his voice. Were there others besides her? Just the one. Rachel wasn't what you'd call a production line number. More of a custom job, if you know what I mean. For my Uncle Eldrin. He knew. He suspected as much. Way back in the city, he had gone to Tyrell Corporation to talk to the man. There'd been that sick jitter in the pillared office suite's atmosphere. A tension shimmer that cops like dogs could catch at the limit of their hearing. And Eldon Tyrell's smile, possessive and sated, the corners of his mouth pulled toward, as if by invisible fishhooks. Every silent thing about him had given away the game. I wouldn't have thought that that'd be something a person like you'd really get along with, being a templant. Really, Deckard? Not as if I had an option in the matter, is it? When my uncle was alive, you would have been right. I was Tyrell property. A templant, right? So you had the templates are the things that are copied. This is interesting. That's not anywhere. That's interesting stuff. Net new stuff that Jeter creates. So we kind of move on to this, these plays within the play. But if we kind of take it to the next book, Replicant Night, this is where I think it really breaks everything. This is the one. So in Blade Runner Replicant Night, we get back to this play within the play concept. So now where are we in our journey? You know, we've traveled from the Do Androids Dream Electronic Sheep novel. We've translated into a film, and now we're going to the next level. Just like Ella Runsiter there in Cold Pack, she's seeing the neighboring Cold Pack people. There's starting to be some kind of, as Philip K. Dick says in Scanner Darkly, there's cross chatter in the film. They call it the cross chatter. And you know, it's also kind of the idea of, let's call it things like in anthroposophy around reincarnation, theosophical ideas of reincarnation. You know, the ideas here are with the past life, let's say past life, where people remember their past lives, right? These are kind of linked to theosophical and anthroposophical ideas. You know, the idea of there is some kind of Gnostic structure to things that's beyond the physical reality. I think that, again, Philip K. Dick goes into this somewhat when he talks about in the exegesis. He says, what if the biochlorides was a title of a book not yet then published? Why the occlusion expressed in Scanner? This strongly implies contact with the future. And here he goes into this thing where he says, The empire may not be a congealed permutation, a status of the dialectic, but the one, which the macro brain desires to and works to avoid, since its uniformity is entropy itself. In a sense, it may be that the empire is any stagnation so rigid that with it, by reason of the dialectic, ceases. Put another way, when we see we know the stagnation has occurred, this is how we see the program experience concealing. We should see the black iron prison. We are supposed to combat that phagocyte-wise, but the very valence of the black iron prison stasis warps us into micro-extensions of itself. And this is what is so dangerous. This is the dread thing it does, extending its android thinking uniformly, more and more exclusively. It exerts power by means of it grows, and thus thwarting the dialectic more and more. So this is sort of, going back to Zizek talking about the Matrix sequels had to be crap because they could never reconcile all of this. The macro brain is well aware of this. It is seen in Christianity itself, in its own doctrine, congealed due to its valence. The very doctrine of combating the hostile world and its power has, to a large extent, been ossified by, and put at service of the empire. Thus I deduce the power and magnitude of the black iron prison, congealed stasis, and is very great. The explanation of who or what fed me back my books, in particular Ubik, is found in the contents of Ubik itself. The formulation of the information entity Ubik. Obviously, I invented an entity which actually existed and therefore could respond with a feedback confirmation. One could analyze this theoretically if there were a macro information entity and you presented a fairly accurate formulation of it. You could reasonably expect the entity to fire a confirmation at you, since the formation puts it forth and helps and benign. In fact, one could test whether such an entity exists, presenting a formulation of it. The ability of Valis, for example, he says, to assume the particular form most syntonic to me, the form of Ubik, is connected by its basic mimicking ability. It never occurred to me that zebra as a form was just another mimicking until the last couple days when I realized that it confirmed in all respects to my conception of the deity, the Logos, as I naturally put forth in Ubik. My brain to Ubik to zebra, mimicry. It analyzed my preconceptions. Ubik isn't the sole source. Ubik just demonstrates my concept. Ubik is a subtle but vigorous confirmation of my formation of Ubik and the nature of our reality. Our situation put forth in Ubik, even if the entity which responded tailored to its gestalt to fit my Ubik formulation, even totally tailored, and it cannot be totally. The ability to do this tailoring is a major part of my formulation. Vide Ubik, etc. I suspect that an analysis of my formation of the nature of Ubik would disclose a presentation of the mimicry ability, since the ability is stipulated ubiquity and invisibility. Hence, mimesis and mimicry are implied, if not overly stated. It's the mimicking ability that is really the exciting realization. I have been right to conceive that as basic to camouflage. Then it is in some sense an invader, probably, from outside the program or simulated reality, as Ubik is in Ubik. This is particularly with Ubik, the invasion of our simulated world. So the idea of it is he's saying that the template of the idea of Ubik exists in his novel Ubik, and then by nature of that, it's sort of communicating back to him how people could interact with Ubik or interact with a world where there was Ubik. So the writing of Ubik is sort of, I'm going to call it a reverse causality. But it's also having this idea of when you look at the meta view, right? When you look at this meta view, you can look at it sideways, sort of. You can see, for example, as we're doing in this podcast today, it starts as a book. It turns into a film. But now there is both a book and a film. And then there's a sequel film and an alternate sequel film. So we start to see the rhizomic branching, right? We start to see the rhizome branch. But now there's self-referential because actually this has a copy of Rachel and this has a copy of Rachel. And actually the script of this is the first scene of this. So they start to have a shuffling, stacked kind of relation to each other. What's great about Replicant Night is just the concept of, in the Blade Runner universe, they are making a Blade Runner film. And there's lots more templates that come out. Roy Batty's template comes up. So you have Roy Batty, here visualized by Rutger Hauer. But in Replicant Night, Roy Batty's, I believe, goes to meet with Holden, right? Or maybe that's in Blade Runner 2, but... So Holden is in the hospital after he was shot up by Leon, and the real Roy Batty goes and visits him in the hospital. So you start seeing there's templates, there's replicants, it's like who was copied, and now they're going to make a movie. The thing had been Kowalski crumpled forward, falling into Deckard and trampling in this shiny wet pavement. Deckard clawed out from behind him and stood upright again, regaining his balance and his breath. The gun that Leon had kicked away now clasped in his hands. The slight motion of the trigger had placed the steel-jacketed bullet like a quick finger to tap at the back of Kowalski's head. She looked dazed, lips parted. Oh no, this is Kowalski. It's not Leon. It's Kowalski. It's the woman. He's doing a good job, thought Deckard. Kowalski looks as dead as a real corpse. Come on, get up, Deckard said in his low voice. It's a wrap. They got it on tape. You can get up now. Blood welled in the hole of Kowalski's altered brow. Then Deckard knew it was real. What the hell? At the edge of the soundstage where the fake streets and recreated L.A. Los Angeles gave way to bare, dry concrete and steel, the floor laced with thick powder cables, data conduits like black snakes. Deckard stood up angrily, ripping the headphones away from his ears. The folding chair toppled over as he threw the phones at the center monitor. The one had shown the view of the eyes of Deckard, the fake one, the one that has been dangling in the now-dead receptionist replicant's fists. Now what? The fake Rachel showed up in her dropping. So it's actually Deckard on set watching them filming a film of Deckard. Right? So this is like inside of the simulation, there is, again, a simulation, right? And I guess you can kind of think of this, I don't know, I oddly had heard this, I had never thought of this before, but it's like, they kind of say in the mouth of madness, but in the Alien sort of franchise, you know how there's the outer mouth, and then there's the inner mouth, okay? And you start to see that this kind of, what's uncanny about the inner mouth is when a mouth opens, you don't expect there to be more mouths inside. And just like in Hamlet, Hamlet sees the play in which he stages a king's assassination, right? And then we see that similar theme done in Game of Thrones, right? Where the play kind of mimics it. But it's in watching the play, right? As Dick says, it's in watching how the simulation unfolds, how the cloning process unfolds, that one gains insight. Now, people have told me that they thought this book was crap. Now, I think it's crazy because I think this is exactly what a Blade Runner kind of world, a dystopic idea would be. It would be the film of Blade Runner being made in the Blade Runner universe. I think it's genius, right? And I think it's recursive. And I think this is why it's very clever, right? So he knew he could fall asleep if he let himself. The fatigue would wash over him, an ocean with its leading edge tinged brown by the bottle's content. He also knew that it would do no good. And it would only last a few minutes at best. The same as it had in the skiff's cramped egg coming back from the outer Hollywood station, a moment of darkness, then dreaming, then waking, with the border blurred between the two states. He used this to raise his head with his open eyes, and Los Angeles to an empty glass. All right, Deckard. He took a deep breath with his forefinger and he pushed the glass away. She found other names. And Sarah's involved again with this as well. Sarah Tyrell. They end up having a shootout. But, so my point of bringing this up is inside of the simulation, we have the simulation. But also we start to have the idea of the degradation, right? This degradation of the simulation, right? But I think you can take it two ways, right? So we have I was going to do a podcast on The Edge of Tomorrow, for example. In this case, the ability to review the simulation gives Vertasky's character and Tom Cruise's character the ability to improve their skills. So just like in a video game, the recursive nature of the simulation allows you to improve your game, which is also a theme of reincarnation. So the reincarnation theme is the same idea where it's one lives multiple lives to break out of the loop, something like this, right? And I think we cover that. I think we cover it in a couple places. Like we cover it in occulted history. Talk about it a bit in our book. Ghost of the Fourth Dimension, Rudolf Steiner, The Ether and Occult Knowledge. Sort of the idea of time. And Ubik plays with time as well. Time starts to fall backwards, right? So I think the idea of being able to review multiple times at the same time is where you get this improvement. But then I also think you have this idea of where you can break through the reality, right? So the idea is at some point in Edge of Tomorrow, for example, they're broken out of the cycle of birth and death, and now it's like the real death is going to happen, right? The real body death, which I guess is a similar theme to the Matrix. It's similar to the breaking character types. The idea of Rachel's clone getting shot right away. It's like you can't really have these permitted. These things can't be permitted. And even the Blade Runner movie, I believe, doesn't actually happen in the film. The same way that it does in the film. So you start seeing that the copy is actually worse than or degraded from the real. Another notion of this in the stacking of things is, if we take it out one more level, I just thought that this was sort of interesting where I like how Rutger Hauer used the Blade Runner font at the cover of his book, right? I think it's kind of used here. It's a different font, but it's got the Blade Runner. It's kind of got that. The A's are the same, but the use here of Rutger Hauer, there's another layer of these things where I think this is a thing that a lot of film buffs do, when you start seeing actors across the films they've made, right? It's another kind of bellwether, or it's another kind of indicator of how we could approach sort of a synchronicity, let's call it. So it's like the idea of as Rutger Hauer visits these different roles he's played. I always think of The Hitcher was a great movie, the original Hitcher. But one thing about this that's interesting, though, and it kind of leans back into Dick, where Dick would talk about, he said in the quote here, who or what fed me back my books? Who or what fed me back my books? He's having this experience of the book writing him, right? Ubik. It's not Ubik by Philip K. Dick. It's Philip K. Dick by Ubik, right? So it's sort of like it's a psychological projection, I guess. I guess it's a complex, right? It's some kind of complex, but I think because the way Dick leans into his complex, and in much of the same way, I was watching somebody explain like how Bill Burr, the comedian, deals with his shadow by using comedy to take the shadow and make it visible, as opposed to Jerry Seinfeld, who has a shadow and he tries to keep it pushed down by presenting things in a detached and sort of matter-of-fact way, and using the fuel of the shadow to inform his comedy, where Burr is more like transforming his shadow into his comedy, but they're different kind of transformers, right? And I think this is like the idea of simulation is where you get to try out different versions of things. But I think what's interesting about Dick is there's a retrocausality of it. Like if you take, for example, the idea that The Reign of Trump by Ben Samagos was written before Trump was elected. This is a book that kind of predicts Trump, and it becomes a backlash at the left. It's kind of a joking backlash at the left. It's satirical. But then with Flowing the Tears of the Flesh Android by Ben Samagos, again, written before the election of Biden, it predicts in the back the rise. Let's give a round of applause here for brave O'Biden for stepping down to tend to his dementia. President Kamala Christmas shrieked to the crowd of apparatchiks. Sideline handlers raised applause signs, and the apparatchiks suddenly performed their cheers for Joe to the television cameras. As the crowd waved to the show of ultra-left military security troops led by General Lumbers, American eyes opened to the light of the post-Biden world, finally freed from responsibility of individuality. You didn't know it, but you've always wanted to be president. Christmas Columna thought to herself with her flesh android thoughts, originating back to the tentacles of the controller dimension. And for the handlers from the COG, it was the same old situation. Different flesh android. After the performance, the flesh of Harris, latex, sticky to the touch, did not emit its vibrations thanks to the high-dosing injections. Via the flesh android form, her perfectly measured tear salinity, controlled by Rona Crown and Dr. J, her cocktail of antipsychotics and stimulants administered by Ancast and Dr. D, and all that was her android body required to develop to become president, cried Lumix. Fall, cried Lumix. Both purchased and sold on credit by the slave caste called the American taxpayer. So you got this kind of idea of the grim nature of when reality becomes like a simulation. You get the return of Trump. There's going to be the resurrection of Trump coming up. But here we have Rutger Hauer as the actor of Blade Runner, who actually wrote some of the lines of Blade Runner. So now you even get the idea of Rutger Hauer sort of sharing in this multiverse with Philip K. Dick and K.W. Jeter. Because just like fan fiction, I've got a fan fiction of Dune Revenant out there, right? So it's sort of like it was my attempt to reconcile the idea of the ending of Dune before there were Dune prequels, having been a big fan of the Dune saga, and I think sort of reconciling that Dune saga was what led a lot of the work that's going on here, like the anthroposophy and alchemy in the Dune saga, really exploring this nature of, is there a way to express oneself? I think people will not like a lot of the Dune sequels that are out there. And I think that the trend was to dumb down Dune with the Sons books. But I think here we have, here we're sort of looking at that idea of how the Roy Batty character, and again, if we look at psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence, you can pick this up in our bookstore as well. We talk about the different androids in film from a sort of a Deleuzian idea of like the rhizome, and also the idea of an artificial psychology, right? What are the complexes of these copies? In Blade Runner, we've got the more human than human replicants. The replicants sort of have a different worldview because they expire, right? So one potential branch of artificial psychology that could emerge in the future is a study of the psychotic or neurotic replicant. Given the advanced name of replicant psychology, it is possible that some of these artificial beings could develop mental health issues similar to those found in humans and like are explored in the film, in Blade Runner. For example, the replicant might experience psychosis, characterized by a disconnection from reality and delusions or hallucinations. We can look at this similarly today with our large language models. Psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence, we go through a lot of the sort of the interface with film as memory. Sort of film is a sort of memory. It's a place where the simulation can exist, and then we can also do those iterations. So think about these large language models of generative AI right now, where you can do lots of training on those models, and you get these different results. So what I thought was interesting about Rutger Hauer playing the role here of Roy Batty is he actually gets to join Philip K. Dick and K.W. Jeter in sort of drafting some of these lines. So he said, the more glaring problem here is the fact that Roy brings Deckard onto the roof. There's no man can lift another man by one arm and pull him up like that. If someone goes over the edge, you catch him. If he's going to pull you down, it's not the other way. The only way you can lift him back up is if you're anchored to something. He weighs 200 pounds. You weigh 200 pounds. You have to have forearms like Popeye to even assist the fall. So here's Rutger Hauer sort of like commenting on the unbelievability of some of the film. Thank God Nexus 6 was really a machine and built in a bonus surprise factor, who's more human than the humans. The other moment I was reluctant about was the scene in which Roy sticks his head through the wall. The wall itself was well prepared, very thin. We get this head through the wall also with Sapper, with Batista's character in Blade Runner 2049. It's kind of like The Shining, it's sort of like using this. So Ridley Scott said, between takes, I wondered about this. He put my head through it, there was like foam and balsa type wood. I said, Ridley, do we have to do it this way? And Ridley goes, we cannot do it another way. But it's too much. It's just too much. Rutger, trust me, it looks wonderful. On the other day with the strike deadline, we shot 25 hours straight. It was a race to the finish of the movie. The film was incredible coming to an end, and we had been really working at an incredible pace for weeks, under the rain machines the whole time. I had reached my breaking point. People were so tired and made a lot of mistakes. Meanwhile, I was soaking wet the whole time because they've got the rain machines on, right? They've got these rain machines on for the whole thing. So they're simulating rain. Let's go into this book. Let's see where they have the rain machines on. In the book, they're talking about the is there an index here? Shooting schedule. Let's see if we can find it. I think we know that there were super rain machines. They had to film that. Everybody was miserable. Like he's mentioning there was a number of problems with the sets being wet. They had to work crazy hours because of that. And they were up against budget and deadlines. I can't find the reference, but that's fine. 24 hours on the set, back to Rutger Hauer, and he says, I can't do it anymore, really. I'm sorry, I'm going to go home. I need to sleep. As I walked away, I could feel the sense of, oh my God, happening among people behind me. But I just kept on going and didn't stop until I got home. The next day after I slept, I telephoned the set. We got lucky. The strike didn't happen, and we're going to finish the movie tonight. I sat down and found the ending. As scripted, the ending page is a page-long monologue with a lot of high-tech language. I wasn't that happy with it. We'd had these operatic death scenes for all the other replicants, and I thought that was enough. I also felt Ripley and I had agreed earlier that when the batteries go, they go. There's no red light going off. There's no goodbye. There's just a dead replicant. Everybody dies before they're ready, Roy Batty included. So I cut 30 of his lines. I saved 2 because I felt there were some pretty moments there. And I added the last line. All these moments will be lost in time, like tears in the rain. When I got in, everyone's gotten some sleep and the mood was improved. The last night of shooting, the real last night, was a happy night. What I love about the final sequence is Roy performs a kind of act of kindness and compassion. He saves Deckard's life. At the moment Deckard falls, Roy grabs. He doesn't really have a reason for doing it. In the last speech, which is a speech that a lot of people like, he's just running programs. For instance, he says, all these moments will be lost in time, before he says, like tears in the rain. I have him swallowed if he's emotionally choked up, but in my mind, I did that because it's his program. He's saying these final swan song lines, and now it goes to say his program, you have to swallow, Roy. And he goes, like tears in the rain. This is a real Nexus 6 bonus moment we could be pleased as his maker. Roy has never been a hero, but for one moment he acts like one. That dove I hold in that scene came about randomly. Here we go. So first of all, let's pause here for a moment. So first of all, his idea, Rutger Hauer's idea of saying tears in the rain wasn't like, it's like the program was letting him to be the hero, right? This is even kind of like in the Matrix lore, right? The Matrix lore where Neo is like the 7th version of it, right? So this idea of simulation, replication, we've all been there before. I think it's also covered a lot. I think the place where we explore this the most is in our Cat 2 Journals out of Lovecraft series. One of those books is The Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. Giuseppe Balsami's Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. In this book, and it's sort of a similar kind of idea that's talking here. The idea that there's an ability. So we have an actor commenting on the world of the character, and he's sort of characterizing that state of the character through imagination. But like Dick says, at what point is Ubik writing Philip K. Dick? And I think what's interesting here is the opposite way of thinking this is, like, for example, as explored in Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, the idea is there's this idea of necromancy, which is having the dead, communicating with the dead, let's call it, or raising the dead, or interactions with it, magic with the dead, right? But actually all forms of writing have a necromantic element to them. If one thinks creatively, that is, as we read the dead works of dead Philip K. Dick, he lives again when we instantiate him into our conversation. And then casting those into a film, like is explored in Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. The reason why artificial intelligence, if we think of that as an engine of simulation, like large language models can repetitively go through a number of different options and then weigh the best outcome, this is informed by its training data. And I think that one of the topics Moldenhauer posits, what I think he posits it at least, is that there's this concept of artificial intelligence, but before that there's artificial memory, and he calls film artificial memory. Right? So the idea of a Bergsonian concept or a Deleuzian concept of film, it's sort of like the idea of artificial memory is film, because what is it? It takes the dream, the electronic dreams that the androids sleep, right? Do androids dream electronic sheep or electric sheep? Our electric dreams are films. And then the extension of that is like the proto interface between film and AI is sort of the internet. The internet is kind of like the living version of where film is sort of acted out, or it's sort of the interaction phase. So I think social media is sort of a second generation of this artificial memory or artificial thinking or the artificial hive. And that spectrum that gets produced here, think of film, you have dreams, and then you actualize dreams into film, and then film is on the internet, and film is shared and socialized on the internet. And then you keep moving this paradigm, to the left and to the right. And you can see that similarly where death, magic about death, writing as necromantic, and then reanimation and reincarnation is looping it back around. So we have him coming up with this, all these moments will be lost like tears in the rain. I know it's not in the script. I told Ridley, but I want Roy to grab a dove as a toy. So this is about the last dove scene. And when he dies, he lets go and it flies away like the soul is leaving his body. I wanted to let the dove do the rest of the acting for me. Ridley agreed, but he wasn't sure, so we shot it two ways, one without the dove and one with it. When we shot it with the dove, things didn't go quite as planned. It was cold and rainy on the roof, and my hand was probably warm. I was sitting there, and I needed to do is let go. My head dropped, Roy died, and I let go of the dove, but it didn't fly. It wasn't moving at all. It was just lying in my hand. I was like, oh, geez, come on now. I shook my hand in a bit, and the dove didn't budge, so I shook it again. This time the dove got up, walked along my thigh, jumped off onto the surface of the roof, and walked off. That's why in the movie there's an extra shot of the dove flying up. They shot that additional footage in post-production, all because the bird didn't perform very well. I was smiling as I write this. At the time we shot Blade Runner, I had very little experience with American movie making. This was a big film and a big experience, and I didn't really know what to expect. I went back to Holland, and I waited nearly a year until the release of the film. On the warm night in June 1982, I was at the premiere of Blade Runner in Los Angeles. So there you have it. I'll probably leave it at that. So yeah, esoteric simulation, the transmigration, Philip K. Dick, K.W. Jeter. I do like that Jeter's work is film noir. I like that it's recursive back into it, and I really think that this is I think that I keep coming back to these books as something that's very inspirational in a cool way to treat a lot of those Philip K. Dick processes. I mean, I think that, even though it's not based on his work, I think that this film owes a lot to K.W. Jeter's kind of thinking. And I think would have liked to have seen. What do you guys think in the comments? Would you have liked to have seen the K.W. Jeter version of Blade Runner? You fans of Blade Runner 2049. Some people like it better than the original. What do you guys think? Where do you sit in the stack of the spectrum of replication, cloning, simulated worlds. Leave a comment below. Check out our Patreon. Check out the bookstore. Thank you guys for your time. And hope everyone's doing well out there. We'll talk to you on the next podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.